When Ibrahim Traoré crossed the gates of the Palace of Unity, surrounded by a crowd of young people shouting his name, no one knew he was carrying a hand-sealed letter. The envelope had been sent directly from the Élysée, without advisors, without an official announcement, without diplomacy. It was an invitation, or perhaps a trap. Inside the letter, the President of France, Antoine Marot, requested a private meeting with Traoré. Not in Paris, not in Ouagadougou, but in Gorom, in the far north of Burkina Faso, a place where the wind lifts the sand like veils of mourning, and the memory of ancestors seems to whisper among the dunes. Marot wanted to meet Traoré there, at the old colonial fort built by the French in 1898. That's where it all began, and that's where it all ended. The day arrived. It was August 4th, the same day that decades earlier, Thomas Sankara had launched his revolution. But now, there would be no podium speech. There would be a confrontation of centuries, face to face, the old empire and the new African blood. The French delegation landed with helicopters under military escort. The makeshift platform had been set up in the fort's inner courtyard, surrounded by walls that had once imprisoned Burkinabe rebels. But today, there were no more chains, only memories. Ibrahim Traoré arrived on horseback. He wore white, with a red scarf around his neck, in memory of the martyrs of the Koudougou massacre. The elders from nearby villages came on foot, in silence, to witness what they called the ancestral reckoning. Marot stood up upon seeing Traoré, smiled, and extended his hand. But Traoré did not shake it. Instead, he pulled a small object from his pocket, an old, rusted shackle, found in a nearby excavation. "This is the legacy of the friendship you claim to have given us," he said, and threw the shackle onto the ground between them. It was the beginning of the turning point. As French and African journalists watched in stunned silence, Traoré took the microphone. "You came here expecting us to smile, to sing, to dance like good hosts. But today there is no dancing. Today, there is judgment." And he pointed to the fort's walls. "Here, you built prisons. Here you tortured. Here, you turned children into porters, men into numbers, women into silence." The French delegation stirred. Marot tried to smile. "Mr. President, we came in the name of reconciliation." Traoré raised a red cloth, stained with dust. "Reconciliation is not possible while the blood still flows." Silence spread. The wind blew. And then he revealed the bomb that would change everything. The night before that meeting, the Burkina Faso government, under Traoré's direct orders, had raided the offices of Aurum Afrique, a French mining company with billion-dollar concessions on Burkinabe land. During the operation, documents were seized. But they weren't just contracts and spreadsheets. They were direct evidence of corruption involving Marot's own cabinet, with millions transferred to offshore accounts, bribes paid to military officials, and secret deals with arms traffickers. In front of everyone, Traoré held up the papers as if delivering a celestial judgment. "You didn't come for friendship, you came for gold, and for our submission." The crowd roared, the cameras captured everything. The world watched in real time. And then, Ibrahim did something even more unexpected. He announced that Burkina Faso was unilaterally terminating all diplomatic and commercial agreements with France in the name of national dignity, and more. He presented a project for a sovereign federation with Mali, Niger, and Guinea, creating an African bloc that rejected Western domination and would control its own resources. Marot was pale. He tried to respond but was interrupted by a sound that shook the ground. Drums, dozens of them, elders, youths, and local musicians began playing in unison. It wasn't a celebration, it was a ritual. It was resistance. And as the drums thundered, Traoré ordered a flag to be raised. But it wasn't the traditional Burkina Faso flag. It was a new one. Red, black, and green, the colors of African liberation. "Today, a new era is born," he said. "An era where the grandchildren of the enslaved no longer bow to the children of the colonizers." And there, in the fort, where history had been written with blood, a new history began to be written with courage. If you're watching this video now, it's because you want to understand how a single gesture, a flag raised in the desert, a shackle thrown to the ground, a truth exposed before the cameras, can trigger a political earthquake that shook the heart of Europe and rekindled the flame of sovereignty across the African continent. So, if this kind of story moves you, if you feel it's time to reclaim the memory of the forgotten and the voice of the silenced, subscribe to our channel now. Here we don't just tell what happened, we tell what was hidden, and together we will unearth the truth, word by word, gesture by gesture, until dignity is restored in every corner of Africa. From this point, we will dive deeply into the behind-the-scenes of this historic rupture. Who helped Traoré? How was the secret operation against the French mining company prepared? What was the European Union's reaction? And most importantly, how did this change the course of history not only for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa? Because true independence doesn't happen with speeches in palaces. It happens in the dust of the earth, in the walls of a fort, in the gaze of those who no longer accept submission. And this story is just beginning. The international reaction was immediate. The BBC opened its evening news with the words, "Burkina Faso breaks with France." Le Monde printed in bold letters, "Diplomatic crisis, the day Paris lost the Sahel." In Brussels, European leaders pressed for quick responses, but no measure seemed to contain the wave that was forming. On social media, the hashtag #JamAfricanUprising dominated global trending topics. Young people from Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Cameroon, and Algeria posted videos turning their backs on French embassies. It was more than solidarity. It was a continental call. In Paris, Maro convened his cabinet in an emergency meeting. The ministers were in panic. The mining sector predicted billion-dollar losses. Security companies warned that the French presence in the region would become unsustainable. "He destabilized us with a speech and a drum," said one advisor. But something even more alarming loomed. Popular support was overwhelming. Even in the suburbs of Marseille and Lyon, young people of African descent chanted revolutionary songs. For the first time, France was being challenged not only abroad, but also from within. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré had called a people's assembly. No closed parliaments. The Revolution Square was transformed into an open-air popular forum. Thousands flocked from all regions of the country. Farmers, students, spiritual leaders, even former soldiers. In the center of the square, a sacred circle was drawn with red sand. In the middle of it, a single wooden chair, the people's chair. And when Traoré sat in it, not as president, but as a son of the land, the elders began to speak, one by one, telling stories of humiliation, plunder, and resistance. A woman with a face marked by time stood up. Her name was Mariam. She had come from Kaya, walking 3 days with her grandchildren. Her voice trembled. "My father fought in France's war. They promised him citizenship. He died a foreigner. My brother died in a mine, buried alive. My son never saw his father, taken to work in a French factory. You call this partnership? This is a blood pact, and the blood has always been ours." The silence was heavy. And when she finished, Traoré stood, walked to her, and knelt. "Today we hear you, Mariam, and we will not forget." That gesture, captured by hundreds of cell phones, would become the symbol of the new era. But the empire was not asleep. 3 days later, a leak from Burkinabe intelligence revealed a DGSE plan, the French Secret Service, to orchestrate an attack on Traoré, blaming radical jihadists. It was the final blow Paris hoped would justify a humanitarian intervention. But the plan failed. Thanks to informants infiltrated in the French consulate itself, the attempt was thwarted. The document outlining the plan was displayed on state television screens. Signed, dated, unequivocal, it was the breaking point. That same day, the ambassadors of Mali and Niger arrived in Ouagadougou for a historic conference. There, the Gorom Pact was signed, declaring the formation of the Pan-African Bloc for sovereignty and economic justice. The pact called for the end of the CFA franc, the nationalization of strategic resources, the creation of a regional currency, and above all, the establishment of an African tribunal for colonial crimes with retroactive jurisdiction. Maro called on the UN. He demanded sanctions. He called the act diplomatic terrorism. But the world was changing. China remained neutral. Russia congratulated Traoré. Brazil, in a UN speech, called the Burkinabe Uprising a civilizational act of courage. Even European countries began to reconsider their blind support for France. Germany, pressured by its own youth, called for a critical review of colonial legacies. Italy sent a delegation for direct dialogue with the new African leaders. But within Burkina Faso, the battle was different. The local elite, many with long-standing ties to Paris, tried to mobilize protests against Traoré. They called him a populist, an incendiary. They accused him of destroying the economy. But the people did not follow. The markets remained stocked. Agricultural production was reorganized into popular cooperatives. The gold, for the first time, refined within the country. The cotton, exported with added value. The people began to see that sovereignty was not an idea. It was bread on the table. Meanwhile, Burkinabe youth experienced a renaissance. Universities began teaching true African history. French ceased to be a mandatory language. Bilingual schools were created with local languages like Moore, Dioula, and Fulfulde. Curricula celebrated forgotten African kings, queens, scientists, and warriors. For the first time, young people learned they came from wisdom, not servitude. And Traoré, despite constant threats, refused to live surrounded by security. He walked through markets, visited villages, sat with griots to hear stories, met with youths to plan futures. He was president, but behaved as a servant of the people, as a disciple of Sankara. Traoré's popularity transcended borders. In Ghana, they raised a mural with his face alongside Kwame Nkrumah's. In Kenya, schools began teaching his speeches as part of contemporary African literature. And in the Caribbean islands, black communities celebrated August 4th as the day of the turning point. But nothing compared to what happened a month later. The UN, pressured by more than 20 African nations, held an extraordinary session to discuss colonial reparations. Traoré was invited to speak. He took the podium in a simple suit, no tie, with the same red scarf around his neck. He spoke for exactly 12 minutes, without attacking, without victimizing, just stating the facts, with the dignity of someone who knows the truth, doesn't need to shout. When he finished, the assembly rose in applause. For the first time in its history, the UN passed a motion recognizing the moral and historical debt of colonial powers to African peoples. It wasn't money, it wasn't a check, but it was the beginning of a new narrative, and everyone knew that was even more powerful. And so, the boy who became a soldier, the soldier who became president, the president who became a symbol, wrote a new chapter in his people's history. And on the last Sunday of that same month, at the stadium now renamed the Field of Dignity, Ibrahim Traoré appeared without security, walking among children playing soccer barefoot. A boy ran up to him and said, "President, are we free now?" Traoré knelt, looked into the child's eyes and replied, "Not yet, but now we know how to fight for it." The boy smiled and ran back to the game. That night, no one sang anthems. They sang stories. Because history was no longer told by invaders. For the first time, it was the people who wrote it, and they wrote with truth and courage.